The water was rising fast. I stood at my bedroom window watching the HOA president's basement fill with murky brown water while his wife screamed into her phone about emergency pumps. 3 houses down, another board member was frantically sandbagging his front door as water poured across his manicured lawn like a river. Meanwhile, my property sat bone dry. Not a single drop touched my foundation. The irony was almost too perfect. These were the same people who had forced me to drain my beautiful lake just 6 months earlier, claiming it posed a flood risk to the neighborhood. They had no idea that I had spent those 6 months learning everything there was to know about water flow, drainage systems, and exactly how to make their nightmare come true. As I watched them scramble to save their homes from the very flooding they claimed to fear, I could not help but smile. That morning, they thought they had won. By nightfall, they would understand that sometimes justice flows exactly where it needs to go. For 15 years, my lake was my sanctuary. When I first bought this property, it was just a muddy depression behind the house. But I saw potential where others saw problems. I spent countless weekends digging, shaping, and lining what would become a crystal-clear lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. The transformation took 3 years and most of my savings. I planted native water lilies along the edges and installed a small fountain in the center. The sound of trickling water replaced the noise of traffic and neighbors. Within 2 seasons, wildlife found my little paradise. Ducks arrived first, then herons, and eventually a family of beavers that built their lodge near the North Shore. Every morning, I would sit on my deck with coffee and watch the mist rise from the water. Dragonflies danced above the surface while fish created gentle ripples below. It was not just a pond. It was proof that with enough effort and patience, you could create something beautiful in your own backyard. My neighbors loved it too. The Johnsons from next door would bring their grandchildren to feed the ducks. Mrs. Chen across the street often commented on how the lake made the whole neighborhood feel more peaceful. Even the mail carrier would stop to admire the water lilies. But paradise has a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention. The trouble started when new people moved into the neighborhood. They were different from the long-time residents who appreciated quiet beauty. These newcomers arrived with manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and strong opinions about property values. Within 6 months, they had taken control of our previously inactive HOA board. The first sign of trouble came as a polite inquiry. Board member Sandra Martinez knocked on my door one Saturday morning with a clipboard and a forced smile. "We are just conducting a neighborhood survey about property features," she said, her eyes scanning my lake. "Some residents have expressed concerns about standing water and mosquito breeding." I explained that the lake had a filtration system and that I had never had mosquito problems. She nodded and scribbled notes, but I could see the disapproval in her expression. "Well, we will be in touch if we need any additional information," she said before walking away. 2 weeks later, I received my first official HOA notice. It was politely worded but clear in its intent. The board wanted to schedule a property inspection to ensure all features met community standards. I called Sandra and tried to reason with her. "The lake has been here for over a decade," I said. "It was here when most of these board members moved in." "That may be true," Sandra replied, "but the HOA has a responsibility to ensure all properties meet current safety and aesthetic standards." I agreed to the inspection, confident that my beautiful lake would speak for itself. I had maintained it carefully, and it added value to the entire neighborhood. Logic and reason would surely prevail. Looking back, that confidence was the biggest mistake I ever made. The inspection team arrived on a Tuesday morning. Sandra came with two other board members I barely knew, Robert Kim, a real estate agent who had moved in 6 months earlier, and David Walsh, who had complained about my lawn height the previous summer. They walked around the lake with measuring tapes and cameras, taking notes and whispering among themselves. When I tried to explain the filtration system or point out the wildlife habitat, they ignored me. Their minds were already made up. "We will have our report ready within 2 weeks," Sandra said as they prepared to leave. "Is there anything specific you are concerned about?" I asked. David Walsh turned back with a cold smile. "We are just doing our due diligence to protect the community." As I watched them drive away, I felt the first chill of real worry. The lake that had been my pride and joy for 15 years was somehow becoming a problem, but I still believed that reasonable people could work out reasonable solutions. I was about to learn just how wrong I could be. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning like a punch to the gut. I signed for it with shaking hands, already knowing it contained bad news. The official HOA letterhead and legal language made my worst fears real. Notice of violation. Unauthorized water feature poses flood risk to neighboring properties. I read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. According to the HOA board, my lake violated community covenants by creating potential flood hazards during heavy rainfall. They cited obscure regulations about water retention and drainage that I had never heard of. The letter demanded immediate action to address the violation or face escalating fines. Flood risk. In 15 years, my lake had never overflowed or caused any drainage problems. If anything, it helped absorb rainwater that would otherwise run off into the storm drains. But the HOA was claiming it posed a danger to neighboring properties. I immediately called a local engineer who specialized in residential drainage systems. Mike Rodriguez had been in business for 20 years and knew our neighborhood well. "This makes no sense," he said after reviewing the HOA letter and examining my property. "Your lake actually improves drainage for this area. It acts as a natural retention basin." Mike provided me with a detailed report explaining how my lake helped prevent flooding rather than cause it. He included soil samples, elevation surveys, and calculations showing that removing the lake would actually increase water runoff during storms. Armed with professional evidence, I requested a meeting with the HOA board. The response came back quickly. My request was denied because the matter was already under official review. That same week, I received 3 more violation notices. My mailbox was 2 inches too high according to community standards. My grass was allegedly uneven in the front yard. The paint on my shutters was the wrong shade of blue. Each violation came with a fine schedule. First offense, $50. Second offense, $100. Third offense, $200. The amounts doubled with each subsequent violation. I realized this was not about legitimate concerns. This was harassment designed to pressure me into compliance. But compliance with what? What did they really want? The answer came during a chance encounter with my neighbor Tom Johnson. He had lived across the street for 20 years and served on various community committees. "I heard about your troubles with the HOA," he said while we were both getting our mail. "You should know that Robert Kim has been asking questions about your lot size and property boundaries." "What kind of questions?" Tom looked uncomfortable. He wanted to know if there were any restrictions on building additions or second homes on larger lots like yours. When I told him your property was nearly 3 acres, he got very interested. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Robert Kim was a real estate agent who had purchased the smallest lot in our neighborhood. If he could force me to remove my lake, he might be able to argue for rezoning or variances that would allow him to expand his own property or build a second structure. This was not about flood risk or community standards. This was about one man's greed and his willingness to use HOA power to get what he wanted. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to present my engineer's report and confront the real issues. The meeting was held in the community center conference room on a Wednesday evening. I arrived early with my documentation and found a seat in the front row. The meeting was a masterclass in bureaucratic manipulation. Sandra Martinez called for order and immediately moved to limit public comments to 2 minutes per person. When I raised my hand to speak about the lake issue, Robert Kim interrupted. "That matter is currently under official review and cannot be discussed in public session," he said. "But I have professional analysis that proves the lake does not pose any flood risk," I replied. David Walsh leaned forward with a smirk. "Sir, you are out of order. Please respect our meeting procedures." They had created a system where I could not defend myself. Every attempt to present evidence was ruled out of order. Every question was deferred to closed executive session. Every procedural objection was overruled by majority vote. I left that meeting understanding that I was not dealing with reasonable people who could be swayed by facts and evidence. I was facing a coordinated attack by individuals who had already decided my fate. The next morning, I called a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Attorney Sarah Chen reviewed my case and gave me the harsh reality. "You are probably right about their motivations," she said, "but proving it will be expensive and time-consuming. HOA boards have broad authority to enforce covenants, even when their interpretations are questionable." She estimated that fighting the violations would cost at least $20,000 in legal fees, with no guarantee of success. Even if I won, the HOA could appeal or find new violations to pursue. "The sad truth is that they have deeper pockets and home field advantage," Sarah explained. "They can afford to drag this out longer than most homeowners." As I drove home from the lawyer's office, I realized I was trapped in a system designed to crush individual resistance. The HOA had power, money, and patience. All I had was the truth, and apparently that was not enough. But I was not ready to surrender my lake without a fight. The final ultimatum arrived exactly 30 days after the original violation notice. The language was stark and unforgiving. Drain the lake within 30 days or face daily fines of $500 plus potential foreclosure proceedings. $500 per day. In 2 months, the fines would exceed my annual salary. They were not just threatening my lake anymore. They were threatening my home, my future, and everything I had worked for. I made desperate phone calls to anyone who might help. The city planning department said HOA matters were private contractual disputes outside their jurisdiction. The county environmental office said they had no authority over residential water features. Local news stations were not interested in another HOA story. Even my neighbors, who had enjoyed the lake for years, remained silent. Fear of HOA retaliation kept them from speaking up. I was completely alone. With 20 days left on the ultimatum, I hired a pump contractor to drain my beautiful lake. The cost was $3,000 I could not afford, but it was cheaper than fighting a legal battle I could not win. The morning of the drainage was the worst day of my life. I stood at my bedroom window and watched 15 years of careful work destroyed in a matter of hours. The pump contractor had arrived at dawn with industrial equipment that could drain a swimming pool in minutes. My lake, which had taken years to establish, was gone by lunchtime. The first hour was the hardest to watch. As the water level dropped, fish began to struggle in the shrinking pools. I had tried to relocate as many as possible to a neighbor's pond, but hundreds of small fish had nowhere to go. They flopped helplessly in the mud as their world disappeared. The ducks and herons that had made my lake their home circled overhead, calling out in confusion. Where was their feeding ground? Where was their shelter? I watched a family of ducks land in the muddy crater that had been their pond, only to take off again in obvious distress. By noon, my lake was a brown, muddy scar in the landscape. The beautiful water lilies lay dying in the sun. The fountain sat silent and empty. Years of carefully cultivated ecosystem had been reduced to a sterile depression filled with dying plants and confused wildlife. But the ecological damage was just the beginning. Within hours of the drainage, I noticed something the HOA had not anticipated. Without the lake to absorb rainwater, runoff from the surrounding properties began flowing directly toward the storm drains. A light afternoon shower created muddy streams across my yard and into the street. More concerning was what happened underground. The lake had created a stable water table that supported the root systems of mature trees throughout the area. Without that consistent water source, several large oaks began showing signs of stress within days. I documented everything with photographs and videos. The dead fish, the displaced wildlife, the erosion patterns, the struggling vegetation. If the HOA wanted to claim this was about environmental protection, I would have evidence of the environmental destruction they had caused. Robert Kim drove by that evening while I was standing in the muddy crater that had been my sanctuary. He rolled down his window with a satisfied smile. "Looks much better already," he called out, "more in line with community standards." The smugness in his voice was the final straw. As I watched his expensive car drive away, something fundamental changed inside me. The reasonable neighbor who had tried to work within the system was gone. The man who believed in compromise and good faith was dead. What remained was someone who understood that justice sometimes requires more than legal remedies. That night, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by photographs of my beautiful lake. Images of morning mist and wildlife, of peaceful evenings and satisfied neighbors, of 15 years of careful stewardship reduced to nothing by bureaucratic bullies. I made a decision that would change everything. If the HOA wanted to claim my lake posed a flood risk, I would show them what real flooding looked like. If they wanted to play games with water management, I would teach them rules they had never imagined. They had used their power to destroy something beautiful and beneficial. Now they would learn that power has consequences, and water always finds its own level. I opened my laptop and began researching municipal drainage systems, water flow patterns, and the specific vulnerabilities of suburban properties during heavy rainfall. If the HOA board wanted to weaponize water concerns, they were about to discover that I could be much more creative with water than they had ever imagined. The lake was gone, but the water was not finished with our neighborhood. In fact, it was just getting started. Robert Kim, Sandra Martinez, and David Walsh had won their battle against my lake. But they had no idea they had just started a war with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to learn about making their lives as miserable as they had made mine. The first lesson would be about the difference between standing water and moving water. They were about to get a very hands-on education. The research began the night they drained my lake. While they celebrated their victory, I sat at my kitchen table with municipal maps, drainage reports, and everything I could find about water management in our neighborhood. I discovered that our subdivision was built on a natural watershed. Rainwater from the surrounding hills naturally flowed toward the area where my lake had been located. For 15 years, my lake had acted as a natural retention basin, collecting and slowly releasing water that would otherwise rush toward the storm drains. The more I studied, the more I understood how removing my lake had destabilized the entire system. I spent weeks at the city planning office, requesting copies of drainage surveys, soil reports, and construction permits for every property in our neighborhood. The clerks knew me by name as I methodically mapped out the water flow patterns that connected all our homes. What I found was fascinating. Our neighborhood sat on a gentle slope that channeled rainwater from the hills down toward the main storm drain system. My lake had been positioned at a critical junction where three natural drainage paths converged. But here was the interesting part. The HOA board members had built their homes in the most vulnerable locations for water accumulation. Their properties sat in natural low points where water would collect during heavy rains if it was not properly managed. Robert Kim's house was built in a depression that had been a seasonal wetland before development. His foundation was actually below the natural water table, making it susceptible to seepage and flooding. Sandra Martinez had purchased a corner lot where two drainage ditches met. The previous owner had installed an expensive French drain system to manage water flow, but Sandra had removed it during landscaping renovations. David Walsh lived at the bottom of a hill where rainwater naturally pooled. His property had the lowest elevation in the entire neighborhood, making it a natural collection point for runoff. I consulted with 3 different engineers and a hydrologist to understand exactly how water moved through our area. Dr. Patricia Williams from the university explained it in terms that gave me chills. Your lake was functioning as a natural flood control system, she said. Without it, the water that was previously stored and slowly released will now flow directly into the drainage system during storms. Properties at lower elevations could experience significant water accumulation. I asked her to identify which specific properties would be most vulnerable if the natural water flow was altered. She pointed to a map and highlighted exactly the homes I expected: Kim, Martinez, and Walsh. These 3 properties are in natural collection areas, Dr. Williams explained. Any increase in water flow or disruption to natural drainage patterns would affect them first and most severely. The irony was perfect. The people who claimed my lake posed a flood risk lived in the exact locations that would flood if my lake was not there to manage the water. But knowledge was only the first step. I needed to understand how suburban drainage systems could be subtly modified to direct water flow in specific directions. I enrolled in online courses about hydrology and water management. I studied soil composition, grade calculations, and the physics of water movement. I learned about berms, channels, and how small changes in elevation could dramatically alter where water flows during storms. Most importantly, I discovered that there were dozens of legal ways to modify drainage on residential property. Installing French drains, creating rain gardens, adjusting grading for better lawn drainage, cleaning and redirecting gutters, and improving soil absorption were all common homeowner activities that required no permits or approvals. The plan began to form in my mind, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. During the day, I worked my regular job and maintained the appearance of a defeated neighbor who had accepted his fate. But at night, I studied topographical maps and calculated water flow rates. I identified exactly where small modifications could redirect the natural drainage toward the properties of the people who had destroyed my lake. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. I would not be creating flooding. I would simply be restoring the natural water flow patterns that existed before suburban development had altered them. If Robert Kim had built his house in a wetland, maybe it was time for that land to remember what it used to be. I was not going to break any laws or destroy any property. I was just going to help water flow where it wanted to go naturally, before human interference had redirected it into my lake. After 6 weeks of research, I had a complete understanding of how to turn the HOA board members' properties into the swamps they deserve to be. The next phase would require patience, timing, and perfect execution. But first, I needed to wait for the right weather conditions. And in our climate, heavy rains were never far away. The rainy season arrived in early October, bringing the perfect conditions for my water management project. I had spent 2 months preparing for this moment, and now it was time to put my education to practical use. My first modification was completely legal and appeared entirely innocent. I hired a landscaping company to install a rain garden near my driveway. Rain gardens are encouraged by environmental groups because they help absorb runoff and prevent erosion. What the landscaping crew did not know was that my rain garden was positioned to capture water that would normally flow toward the storm drain and redirect it toward Robert Kim's property. The installation took 2 days and cost $800. To any observer, I was being a responsible homeowner by improving my property's environmental impact. In reality, I had just created a funnel that would channel hundreds of gallons of rainwater directly toward Kim's foundation during the next heavy storm. Phase 2 involved cleaning and adjusting my gutters. This was also completely normal maintenance that any homeowner might do. I repositioned several downspouts to direct water away from my foundation, which was smart water management. The fact that this repositioning sent the water flowing across my property line toward Sandra Martinez's backyard was just a practical consideration of topography. Working at night during light drizzle, I made subtle adjustments to the grading around my property. A small berm here, a shallow channel there, nothing that would be noticed during a casual inspection. Each modification appeared to be part of normal yard maintenance while actually serving as part of a larger system to redirect water flow. The most creative modification involved installing a French drain along my back property line. French drains are common solutions for wet areas and completely legal in residential areas. My French drain collected water from a wide area and concentrated it into a pipe that emerged at the lowest point of my yard, which happened to be directly uphill from David Walsh's property. I had spent 3 months studying the natural water flow patterns in our neighborhood. Now I was simply helping water flow where it wanted to go before development had interfered with the natural drainage. The first test came during a moderate rainstorm in late October. I stood at my kitchen window with coffee and watched the results of my modifications. Water flowed beautifully through my rain garden and down the slope toward Robert Kim's house. My redirected gutters sent streams of water cascading toward Sandra Martinez's property. The French drain system hummed quietly as it concentrated and directed flow toward David Walsh's backyard. By morning, I could see standing water in Kim's side yard and soggy patches in Martinez's flower beds. Walsh's lawn looked like a sponge that had absorbed more water than it could handle. I put on my concerned neighbor face and walked around the neighborhood, checking on everyone after the storm. "Looks like you got some water accumulation," I said to Robert Kim as he stood in his soggy yard. "Yeah, it is weird," he replied, frowning at the puddles around his foundation. "I have never had drainage problems before." "Probably just a heavier than normal storm," I suggested helpfully. "You might want to look into some drainage improvements if it keeps happening." Similar conversations with Martinez and Walsh confirmed that all three were experiencing new water problems, but had not yet connected them to each other or to me. The second test came 2 weeks later during a heavy downpour that lasted 8 hours. This time, the results were more dramatic. Kim's basement developed a small leak that required him to run a dehumidifier constantly. Martinez discovered that water was pooling against her foundation and seeping into her crawl space. Walsh found standing water in his garage after rain came through gaps around his foundation. I made sure to document everything with photographs taken from public areas, not because I planned to gloat, but because I wanted evidence that my water management improvements were working exactly as designed. The beauty of the system was that each modification was completely defensible. Rain gardens, proper gutter drainage, French drains, and appropriate grading were all recommended by water management experts. I had simply implemented best practices for residential water control. If anyone questioned my improvements, I could provide documentation showing that I was following professional guidelines for responsible water management. The fact that responsible water management on my property meant redirected water flow toward my neighbors was just the natural consequence of topography and physics. By December, all three HOA board members were dealing with ongoing moisture problems. Kim had hired a waterproofing company to seal his basement. Martinez was researching French drain installation to address her foundation issues. Walsh had installed a sump pump in his garage to handle water accumulation. None of them had connected their individual problems to my property improvements. They were too busy dealing with the symptoms to investigate the cause. But I knew that the real test was still coming. We had experienced normal autumn rains so far. The winter storm season would bring the heavy, sustained rainfall that would truly test my water management system. I spent the quiet months fine-tuning my modifications and preparing for the weather pattern that would deliver the justice I had been working toward. The HOA board had used their power to destroy my beautiful lake. Soon they would understand that sometimes the water finds its own way back. The storm system arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, bringing the kind of sustained rainfall that tests every drainage system in the region. The Weather Service had issued flood warnings for low-lying areas, and I knew this was the moment when months of careful preparation would finally pay off. I woke up at 5 in the morning to the sound of rain pounding on my roof. This was not the gentle precipitation we had been experiencing. This was a serious storm that would dump several inches of water over the next 12 hours. I made coffee and positioned myself at my kitchen window to watch the performance I had been orchestrating for 4 months. The rain started slowly, but within an hour it was falling steadily enough to activate my drainage modifications. Water flowed through my rain garden like a river, carrying runoff from the hills behind my property directly toward Robert Kim's house. My repositioned gutters created waterfalls that cascaded down the slope toward Sandra Martinez's property. The French drain system worked perfectly, concentrating water from a wide area and directing it like a fire hose toward David Walsh's backyard. By 8 in the morning, I could see standing water accumulating in all the right places. Kim's side yard had become a shallow pond that was lapping against his foundation. Martinez's flower beds were underwater, and water was beginning to pool around her patio. Walsh's property looked